Hello and welcome to BCM300 Game Experience Design. This week we are looking at mass market games and the niche game industry. So we're going to start with a look at mass market games. Mass market games are proprietary titles that have come to dominate the shelves of large retailers. So when you go to Kmart, Target, Big W, in the US, of course, it's Walmart. You will find these mass market games on the shelves. Mass market games are typically associated with the activity of board games by the general public. Games like Scrabble, Monopoly, Trouble are associated with the tabletop games industry. And most people, maybe could be included in that. But most people in the US and Australia associate these games with the board game industry. It's quite different in Europe and Asia, but this is typically what we know of as the industry. So mass market games typically fall into three categories, one of three categories, and sometimes there is crossover. That's important to point out. So I want to go through these three categories and have a look at those specifically. So the three basic types of mass market games are family games, party games, and license games. Now the book that I'm drawing a lot of this information from this week is Stuart Wood's Eurogames, the Design, Culture and Play of Modern European Board Games. It's available in the library, and if you're interested in more detail with regards to the quotes in this lecture, then you can track that down. So family games. The family game genre developed out of parlor games in the 19th century and was stabilized and industrialized by the mass market in the 20th century. So as we said, Scrabble and Monopoly, which were created in 1935, the Game of Life, which is 1960, and of course Clue or Cluedo from 1948. Woods says this: over time, the rules to these games have become part of the Western cultural lexicon, and they are easily transferred from one generation to the next. A result of this is that shelves of large retail outlets are typically dominated by games that were in many cases designed more than half a century ago. While these games might be termed classic, and remember they're not classical games that we looked at last week, but they're classic in the sense that they occupy a central position in cultural understandings of board and table games. And they have arguably acquired this status largely through a combination of manufactured nostalgia and effective marketing. So you can see here, of course, the image is of Ludo. So family games are designed, or as Woods is saying, were designed 50 years ago for general family entertainment. They weren't designed to take a long time, although some, like Monopoly, of course, can. And they were to entertain children away from the television. The second form of mass market board games are a little newer. These typically follow the success of Trivial Pursuit in the 1980s. And these are games which follow in the model of the Victorian era parlour game, in that the focus isn't necessarily on the game mechanics or story, but rather on the social interactions that these games support. And of course, Pictionary is a great example of that. Very simple. Can be played without the Pictionary box. You can play Pictionary with some pens and paper. So they're typically simple, they're typically very robust, and can accommodate a large number of players. And they were designed for mostly adults, particularly Pictionary and Trivial Pursuit. But we've seen games like Cranium and Taboo, which replicate this design and are much more approachable for a family situation. So you can see the party game as being a hybrid of the family game, but also much more designed for adults and the adult market. And that brings us to the third type of mass market game. And again, you can see how this overlaps with family games, and you can see how this overlaps with party games. And this is the notion of the licensed game. The licensed game can be typically traced back to the emergence of television in the 1950s. The arrival of television had a significant impact on the way leisure time was spent in the average home. Although games manufacturers had often overlooked current trends and fads, the arrival of television had a far more dramatic impact on business than it did earlier cultural trends. So since then, each new television show brought with it another opportunity to repackage familiar mechanics with a new theme. So what's going on here is that what we used to call tie-ins, so board game tie-ins to particularly popular games, television shows, would often just replicate the mechanics and the processes of other games with a new dynamic to it. So these were designed for fans of the television show, not necessarily fans of board games. Often they weren't very good games, but that's a very subjective opinion, a very subjective understanding of these games. And there are plenty of movie tie-in board games that people loved and enjoyed immensely. But it was a really useful way to engage in what we call transmedia, which was the replication and the repackaging of themes and characters and ideas across multiple media formats. And of course, we see this today and over the past 30 years in video games. There's some examples here: the Dancing with the Stars card game, the Dexter board game that features a lot of Clue or Cluedo-like elements, and of course there's some famously bad board games like the Gossip Girl game and the Glee board game. However, again, if you played these games and you enjoyed them, we're not throwing shade. A common and notable hybrid of these forms stems from the growth in licensing and crossover branding, where previously the large game manufacturers might have commissioned new, if unoriginal, designs to accompany ephemeral trends. There is now a tendency now to merely weave them together with existing game licenses. A quick survey of toy giants Hasbro's range of board games in 2010 revealed Monopoly 3 Spider-Man, Monopoly SpongeBob SquarePants, Monopoly the Transformers Collector's Edition, the Game of Life Pirates of the Caribbean, the Game of Life Simpsons, and so on. And I certainly know, I've certainly seen people online on social media who just collect Monopoly titles. And as well as, people who just collect Simpsons memorabilia all have the Simpsons version of Monopoly. Now, if you enjoy Monopoly, by all means, have at it. But this is a very unoriginal game design nowadays that's just replicated into infinity. So Woods and others are very critical of mass market games and the mass market industry. They argue that it is essentially that it is built upon the repackaging of 20th century proprietary games, party games, and a few original titles that appear yearly to satisfy fans of particular media licenses. And you do see some new mass market games occasionally. As designer and publisher Mike Petty notes, the larger game companies such as Hasbro and Mattel now have little motivation to explore the potential of new game styles, and they are reluctant to even consider game submissions from outside a small pool of developers. Greg Kostakian is an industry commentator and board game designer, and he eloquently affirms that Hasbro is fat and happy and basically doesn't give a fuck about innovation. So within the board game designer community and the tabletop games fandom, Hasbro and particularly Mattel are not considered highly or well regarded. However, it needs to be pointed out that these games are massively successfully commercial hits. They sell enormous amounts of copies each year, and we can't just dismiss them. And as you can see there, Hasbro owns Jenga, and I think Jenga is a great game. I think Connect 4 is a great game, and these are staple games that families love, and not just families, but anyone can really enjoy. So that's going to bring us to the rise of hobby games, or what I prefer to call niche games. The hobby gaming industry, and we're going to talk about it in more detail in this lecture. So the hobby games industry really began to take off in the 1950s. And as we'll see, it went through a surge of popularity in the 1970s. It had a high point in the mid-90s, and then as video game culture took over and the internet became to dominate in the early 2000s, it started to drop off a little. But it was revived by that very same internet culture and interest in tabletop games by video game developers. And the hobby games or the niche games industry has gone from success to success, growing internationally year on year from 2010, and now is a massively profitable global games industry. And so, one of the things I want to get across to you in this subject is the importance of niches and the skills that we're trying to get you to learn in terms of prototyping and playtesting and examining feedback and iterating around feedback. This, of course, applies to to all niche industries, regardless of whether they're board games, sports industries, fashion, media content of all kinds. The rise, the internet and digital social media has meant the success of the rise of niches. So they are mass in terms of they have an enormous audience, an enormous consumer base, but they are much more audience driven and much more socially connected to the audience and reliant on audience feedback in order to do well. And that's what distinguishes them from the mass market. So, contrary to the impression that might be gathered from the shelves of large retailers, game design has experienced significant advances over the last 5 decades. Entirely new genres of games have emerged and evolved outside of the market. So much so that the landscape of contemporary board and table games is radically different than it was in the 1950s, even the 1990s, when the larger companies seemingly decided that there were enough good games to satisfy the average consumer indefinitely. So I'm going to proceed through these slides with the idea that you probably have some kind of mass market game at home, or when you were growing up, you had some kind of mass market game. And we're going to jump into looking at these new genres of games within the niche games industry in order to give you a little bit more background and a little bit more understanding of where these niche products came from. Hobby niche games are specialist games that feature radically different emphasis on style, strategy, mechanics, and theme than the games in the mass market category. Hobby niche games appeal to adults, but also to younger players, and they tend to be genuine, right? They tend to really embrace their theme and demonstrate really well-honed mechanics. Woods says the use of the term genre can be highly problematic, but hobby games have come to share a number of recognizable formats that have emerged over the last century. Genre divisions, even when seemingly well established, are inherently subject to revision as new texts emerge and the boundaries between the groups shift. So what we're doing here is we're setting up the idea that within the hobby or niche games industry, there is a set of dominant genres. And I'm going to explain what those genres are in a sec. But it's also important to remember that there is a lot of hybridity and there's a lot of movement between these genres. So a game might fit into multiple genres at the same time. So let's talk about what those genres of hobby gaming or the niche games industry is. So the oldest is known as war games, and this is a tabletop simulation of war. And I'm going to unpack all of these in the next few slides. You might be familiar with pen and paper role-playing games. These are the foundation for the role-playing games that we play in video games. And you probably don't know, you might know this term, but the term Eurogame is a very key genre. Ameritrash is another genre, and although it has the word trash in it, it's really a term of endearment. It's a really kind of in-house kind of in community understanding of what Ameritrash means. And then, of course, there are collectible card games. You've probably heard of Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic the Gathering, and there are some other examples that I want to look at today. All right, so let's kick on and start to deal with the history of war games. So I want to go through this pretty quickly. Wargaming has its origins in the simulation of military academies and the training of officers. War games was a hobby that gained resurgence in interest in the 1950s, around the first kind of modern war games. The first being Tactics in 1954 by Charles Roberts. According to R.C. Bell's book, Board and Table Games from Many Civilizations from 1979, there were 7 different types of gaming boards that were found cut into the great roofing slabs of the temple at Kurna in Egypt, which was built around 1400 BC. So and of course the game of 16 soldiers has long been played in Sri Lanka and parts of India. So this is connecting to the material last week. So when we talk about war games, this is an ancient both military training strategy and popular form of entertainment. So Kriegspiel was a game system that was developed for Prussian and German army officers, first created in 1812. And you can see here it's played on a map with grids, and these little wooden blocks indicate troops and different types of troops. And a table was divided into a large number of squares, and different terrain types were used. This is a wooden box set of Kriegspiel down here with different units. It's played on a map, There's what's known as a fog of war, which means that you can only have information in the game about your enemy's units that you can actually see with your units on the table. There were games mechanics for communicating orders between units, and it actually required what's known as a games master. So you might have two players against each other, and there would be a third player who would adjudicate the combat and the systems. And the bigger games could accommodate up to 10 people on each side. So these were very serious, strategically played sessions that were a great military teaching tool. So, okay, so this is a beautiful set of Kriegspiel for a set of rules that was created by Guy Debord, who was a French filmmaker who was very fed up with cinema as the medium of expression, and he designed his own version of Kriegspiel with Becker Ho and published that in 1977. And this is a beautiful metal set that was called The Game of War. And you can actually play this game online. If you do a search for Debord and Kriegspiel, you'll get the online app so that you can play that. Another important influence on the wargame genre was science fiction author H.G. Wells' book called Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. This was a version of the toy soldiers with official rules for playing on the floor. And it had rules for infantry and cavalry and artillery. And even though he was known as a pacifist, Wells saw the value of learning military thinking, logistics, engineering, and engagement, and thought that an entertaining experience was a good way for people to learn the lessons that this kind of military thinking could impart. So after World War II, games like Tactics became popular. And Tactics, of course, was published by the Avalon Hill Games Company. It featured what is known as an odds ratio combat table. And I'd like you to take a look at this, because this is a very useful game mechanic that you might like to think about for your own games. So a combat's results table is used in a war game to standardize the results of engagements between different units. There is an attacker and a defender. The attacker rolls a dice and the defender rolls a dice. You then compare the strength and abilities of the units on the table, and the dice that are rolled determine the result. So this is an important part of the simulation. There is it's not entirely random, because depending on what you attack with, you have a higher strength, and depending on what you defend with, you have a higher defense. So an attacker with a higher attack versus a defender with the lower defense is going to do worse than an attacker. The defender is going to do worse than a low strength attacker and a high strength defender. So this is a really great way of simulating game conditions such as attack power, so a tank attacking a troop is going to have more success damaging that troop than another troop attacking a troop, or a troop attacking a tank. And again, this doesn't need to be military. You can use a combat results table for a range of different simulations, whether it's trying to be the best YouTuber, right? You can have a game in which you're trying to be the best YouTuber, and you're rolling on a results table like this to determine how your audience responds. So dice are just a really important way of providing an engaging and interesting simulation within a game experience. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be, roll a dice, move that many squares. It can be roll a dice and look at this table and find out what it does. Or roll a dice and then your opponent rolls a dice, or everyone rolls a dice and adds the score or combines the score or looks on the table. And so dice are a really important element in adding a little bit of randomization and a little bit of uncertainty into your game experience. So Avalon Hill became a specialist in war games and the leading publisher in the niche industry in the 1950s and 1960s. They catered to a very niche audience, but they sold very well, and they recreated ancient battles, historical battles, as well as fantasy and combat in science fiction settings. Avalon Hill pioneered many of the staples of contemporary war games in the 1960s and 1970s, including the use, that you can see here, hexagonal grid. So rather than using squares or spaces in a kind of Monopoly linear movement model, they enabled a much more interesting and wide range of movement by using these combat hexes. They also enabled terrain effects, different types of movements. So if you're moving down the road, maybe you move a little bit faster. You could even simulate weather conditions. Avalon Hill is now a subsidiary of Wizards of the Coast, and that we're going to talk about them in a little while, which itself is owned by the giant industry Hasbro. So as you saw from Mass Market, Hasbro has an enormous reach in the niche industry of tabletop game experiences, not unlike Disney does in the screen media entertainment industry. All right, let's move on to role-playing games. I'm sure you've all heard the term role-playing game. You probably are aware that Dungeons and Dragons is a thing and has been a thing for a while. But if you're not familiar with role-playing games, I want to give you just a quick primer and a quick overview of what they are. Okay, so tabletop role-playing games, RPGs, are a collective storytelling experience. There are games with lots of rules and lots of tables that you have to look up when you're rolling dice, but at the core, an RPG on the tabletop is this shared storytelling experience. It's usually played face-to-face, but as we can see with Twitch and Discord, it's actually very easy to run a role-playing game online. Role-playing games are often set in fantasy worlds or science fiction worlds or alternative histories, and players take it in turns to decide on character actions. So in most role-playing games, you have an individual character, and you make decisions based on your character's motives and desires. Most RPGs involve a game master, often called a dungeon master. They're the storyteller. Everyone is contributing to the story, but they're the one who sets up the narrative, and they're the one who implements the rules. And so the DM plays all of the other characters in the setting. They play the antagonists and what's called the non-playing characters. The DM is the guiding hand who controls the setting and helps direct the story and presents players with challenges, puzzles, battles, and other scenarios, often called encounters. It's a really fun experience. If you've not played a role-playing game before, I highly recommend checking out Twitch TV and watch some of the Geek and Sundry events where they're playing role-playing games to get a sense of how that actually works, because it can be really funny and interesting and fun. Okay, so the most familiar RPG is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons, and it has many different settings within that title. Other popular games that I've played since high school include Star Wars, Palladium, Shadowrun, Middle-earth, Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, GURPS, and one of my favorites actually was based on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Surprisingly fun world to play in. Dungeons & Dragons is now up to its 5th edition. It was introduced in 1974 and largely created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, although there were other contributors. It's now published by Wizards of the Coast, which is, as I said before, is a subsidiary of Hasbro. Much of D&D is inspired by Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and books like Robert E. Howard's Tarzan, and of course elements of Lovecraft. In D&D, the typical player chooses a fantasy race, like an elf, a dwarf, a halfling, or an orc, and they choose a character class, and this is a wizard or a rogue or a paladin or a fighter. And so you have your race, which gives you specific things that you can do in the game, and your class, which gives you specific things that you can do. Wizards can cast spells, fighters are good with armor and swords. Rogues and thieves are good at disabling traps and getting into places and stealing things, of course. And there's a whole, we could spend a lot of time talking about D&D. To avoid copyright and copyright problems with Lord of the Rings, Arneson and Gygax changed a lot of the names of the races and added their own description and filled in their games with rules for magical weapons and items and monsters and spells. And of course, this is something that you can think of for your own game design. You can create your own role-playing game. You don't need tons of rules. You don't need tons of dice, but I'm going to talk about dice in a second. But you can create your fantasy setting. You can create your own races, your own character classes, and set up a story that you want players to engage in. That said, players do love dice. One of the reasons why players like getting into Dungeons & Dragons is because you get different type of dice. You get the D4, the D6, the D8, the D10, the D12, and most famously, the D20. And a whole range of different tables. Most of the dice are used to determine damage. So a dagger might do a D4 because it's smaller, and a giant two-handed weapon might do a D12. But it's the D20 that is used most often to determine the outcomes of events in the game. So a dungeon master might say, okay, you're trying to convince a person that you're an honorable hero. Roll the D20 and you have to get more than a certain number. Sometimes the DM will tell them what the number is. Sometimes it'll be kept secret. So the player rolls the dice and then they add their charisma bonus, so their stat bonus, right? So you get different stats for your characters: strength, wisdom, intelligence, charisma, dexterity. And so you're trying to convince someone, you're trying to be eloquent. And so you get your charisma bonus and you add that to the D20, you get 13, but you were trying to get 17 because it was quite difficult. So it's higher towards 20. And so the DM says, you tried valiantly to convince this person, but they were unmoved by your plea. So as players use dice and role-playing decisions, they succeed or don't succeed at defeating monsters, overcoming obstacles, solving puzzles and other challenges. And and when they do this, they receive experience points. And every time you get the set number of experience points, you go up a level. And every time you go up a level, you get more hit points and you get more bonuses to your skills, and you might get more spells. And so your characters progress from level 1 to level 2, level 3, level 4. And that means you can tackle harder and harder experiences and challenges. So it's a absolutely wonderful game system. All right, so that's war games and RPG games, and now I want to move on to talking about another genre of tabletop experiences, and this is Euro games. So Euro games first became popular in Germany, and they spread around the world in the 1990s, and they're now considered to be in part of what's known as the golden age of Euro games. So also known as German-style games, Euro games are a class of tabletop game that emphasizes strategy and minimizes luck. So we've been talking a lot about dice so far. Well, Euro games don't use dice for the most part. There are examples where there are dice, but most Euro games really try to minimize the role of luck and maximize player agency, so player decision making. War games pit one or two or more players against each other directly. Euro games actually try to minimize conflict. When you're playing a Euro game, you're trying to build your thing using resources and decisions in order to get the most game points. So there's still competition. Everyone's trying to get the most points. But in a Euro game, I'm not attacking you directly most of the time. And the story comes from building your engine, if you like, your little part of the world, rather than in RPGs where you're collectively telling a story. The story is much more emergent in Euro games, whereas you're building your thing here. For example, you might be building, gone too far. You might be building a farm. And, you might be, putting sheep and pigs. And so Euro games are often more quaint and stylistic and elegant. They often feature wooden components, and these wooden components are affectionately known as meeples. So Euro games are highly thematic. It might be about building a winery. It might be about trading in ancient Greece. It might be about building the best farm or building the best village. And so while there is often a theme, the theme is usually heavily abstracted through the core game mechanics. So let's have a quick look at some of the most well-known Euro games. I'll skip through a couple of these. I just want to talk about... So Catan. Catan is a really interesting game in that it has these hexagonal tiles rather, that you put together. And rather than placing your pieces directly on them, you are placing your pieces so they connect different tiles together. Carcassonne. Carcassonne is a lovely game in which you draw little tiles out of a bag and you place the tile down, and then you have a set number of meeples that you can place on the tile in order to score points. So this is a highly strategic, very fast, very interesting game where the board is never the same between two different games. Power Grid is a little bit different, where the board is the same, and in Power Grid you are trying to build a power network across. This board is the US board, but there's the Australian board, the German board, and so on. And so you're trying to get the most points by building your power network on the board. And so you can learn the board, and you can experiment with different strategies to maximize your outcomes. Okay, let's move on. So here's a list. Okay, here's a list of prominent, what we call Euro designers. Some very famous names here, like Uwe Rosenberg, Bruno Cathala, and not all of these are European. You will notice that a lot of them are men, and this is an industry that has historically been dominated by men. But over the course of this subject, we'll be looking at some of my favorite board games designed by women and illustrated by women, and so I don't want to give you the impression that this is an industry that is not attempting to change and modernize. Let's have a quick look at Settlers of Catan. So Settlers of Catan is actually one of the reasons why the niche game industry took off. This was one of the breakthrough games that in the mid-1990s became hugely popular because it offers something very different to the mass market experience, but is really approachable and can be played by people who are familiar with mass market games but are looking for a bit of a different experience. It's also really popular because the game is different every time you play it, because the board is different because you randomly distribute these hex tiles. Players attempt to create a settlement by placing roads and buildings and towns, by trading in resources, including timber, metal, wood, and wheat, which can be used to trade with one another and used to assemble buildings. You're trying to score the most number of points, and there are achievements. So if you get the longest road, you can achieve the bonus points. And it's usually the first to 10 points who wins. Settlers of Catan has sold more than 22 million copies. That figure's a little bit old. It'd be up around 25, if not more. It's been published in 30 languages, and it was the real breakout hit in the 90s. And that led to a series of games becoming popular that didn't fit the mass market mold. And again, sorry, I'll just go back there for a sec. Pointing out things that you can think, I think you can think about for your own board game design. And this modular board, like we're using hex tiles that randomize the board experience, is a fantastic mechanic that other games like Takenoko have been able to make use of. Remember, there's no copyright over individual mechanics. There's copyright over theme, so you can't take the Catan theme and make that your own, but you can definitely take the individual mechanics and add it to your own theme, whether it's science fiction or a different colonizing theme, or this could be a plant or bacteria trying to establish itself in a petri dish, whatever, and you can use this hex-based game system or game mechanic rather. For your own system. So you should be paying attention to all sorts of mechanics that you can adopt and think about for your own game designs. All right, this brings us to the fourth genre, and we're getting towards the conclusion now. So I'm just going to go through this quickly, and this is Ameritrash. So Ameritrash games employ a very rich theme. They often have direct player-to-player conflict, and they involve a high degree of luck. So quite different to the Euro game, almost at the opposite end of the spectrum. American games often feature many plastic components and have very lush cardboard elements, which emphasize the thematic dimensions of the game. Examples of classic Ameritrash games, and of course it's called Ameritrash because these largely come from American designers. Axis and Allies is like an upscaled version of Risk. It's played in a 1944, I think, war setting with lots of little soldiers and tanks and planes, and it takes a long time, and you get to take over the world or defend the world, and one person plays the Axis countries and one person plays the Allies countries, and you basically balance, but your individual countries have different bonuses. For example, I think Japan has bonuses in developing ships, that kind of thing. Fantastic game, but can take a weekend to play. Dune is a classic game. It's been re-released that has fixed some of its issues, but it was one of the first Ameritrash game. Cosmic Encounters, lovely science fiction themed game with lots of different sci-fi races that you can play. Talisman is like a Ameritrash version of Monopoly, where you get, which is a bit like an RPG, and then you get your own character, but you're going around a board and you're developing your character and getting more powerful. And of course, the granddaddy of Ameritrash games is Twilight Imperium, where you have tiny little spaceships. Again, notice the hex board, like Settlers of Catan, and you have individual races that get powers, and you've got to fight or negotiate with other players. And I think you can get up to 8 players. Twilight Imperium can take forever to play, but it is a fantastic experience. One of the biggest publishers of Ameritrash games is Fantasy Flight Games. This is a company that's based in Roseville, Minnesota, in the United States, but it was sold in 2017, I believe, to a French company called Asmodee, which is now owned by a Japanese company. So, when you say Ameritrash, it doesn't really mean anything, particularly because while these games might be developed in the US, they're certainly certainly printed and manufactured in China. Fantasy Flight Games is one of my favorite games developers. Some of my favorite games over the years, particularly they make a lot of Lovecraft themed games, which I really enjoy, and a lot of card games, which I really enjoy. But you can see here, particularly in these examples, that Fantasy Flight are actually super plugged into the licensing model. So here you can see games from another games company that produces war games, and that's Warhammer. So you might have heard of Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy. Well, Warhammer is produced by Games Workshop, and they do tabletop war games, but Fantasy Flight makes board game versions of that. You can also see down here that Fantasy Flight have had a long-standing relationship with LucasArts and now Disney, and they produce a huge range of tabletop Star Wars experiences. And in fact, you can see behind me is the Star Wars ships that are down the bottom here that are produced by Fantasy Flight Games. Okay, so we are nearly done. The last genre to talk about is collectible card games. And this is definitely something that you can quite easily make for yourself as part of this subject. One of the most recognized category of contemporary hobby or niche games is the collectible card game. Also known as trading card games, these games were popularized by titles like Magic the Gathering, which was designed by Richard Garfield and published by Wizards of the Coast originally in 1993. A collectible card game usually features 2 players, each drawing cards from a singular deck of cards, and most often the card deck ranges between 40 and 60 cards. These decks are usually assembled by purchasing booster packs of blind cards. So the booster packs are, I think in Australia, they're between $5 and $7, and you open them up and you get between 7 and 12 cards, and some of those cards will be rare, and some of them will be uncommon, and some of them will be common. And then you can trade those cards with other people, but you can also buy the individual cards directly online, and then you build up your deck, and you play against each other. This looks like Magic, and there are enormous conventions and weekly game nights at stores like Good Game in Wollongong, where they have Magic nights. They'll have Yu-Gi-Oh events. They'll have Pokemon events. And particularly in Magic, because some of these cards are really rare, the value of those cards is exceptionally high. Examples include, as I said, Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon. What I wanted to show here at Pokemon is that this is actually the digital version of the trading card game. And so many of these games actually have digital versions where you can play with people online all around the world. There's another model which I quite like, that was created by Fantasy Flight Games, and this reduces the rarity. So Netrunner and Arkham Horror is you buy the base set, and then every month Fantasy Flight Games publishes a small pack of cards, 20 to 30 cards, and those packs kind of contribute to the story or the theme, and you can add those cards to your decks, or you can play through specific challenges. And so it does away with that variation in the market about having really expensive cards, and is a lot lower cost of entry in order to be competitive. It's still expensive, but really, really great model. Just recently, there's a new Marvel game. I can't remember the name of it, but you just buy the individual hero pack, and you can play that, and you don't have to worry about trying to track down individual cards. All right, so that's the end of this lecture. I'm hoping that that's provided a really solid foundation so that you understand the mass market industry as it is today, and that you can accurately, look at a game now on something like Board Game Geek, or go into a store like Good Game or Zing, and be able to kind of identify what genre. I think if anything I want you to take away from this lecture today is being able to identify what a particular product in the niche industry is, and what genre it might be belonging to, and that will help you in understanding its mechanics and its themes. Thanks for playing.